Right. I think it's safe to assume that everybody in the room has had some thoughts or concerns about the aging process or getting older. I know I've reached that magical age where things aren't working the way they once did. For example, I my hair is turning gray. I used to have more gray hair, but it's falling out. I used to do things like hike mountains, but now it seems that getting out of a chair without a groan or two is a bit of a challenge. But in addition to this, I'm also becoming more susceptible to age-related diseases like Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease, and some cancers. But actually, I think the worst thing for me is watching what the aging process is doing to the people around me. I'd like to introduce you to some very important people in my life, and I refer to them as the three Nicks. One of them, my dad, Nick Eskew, who unfortunately passed away in 2023. Another one, Nick Ovsenik, a very important mentor to me. He unfortunately passed away in 2022. And that third Nick is my wife, Nicole, who, thank goodness, is still with us today. And I'd like to keep it that way. And I can say without any exaggeration here that if I'm half the person that any one of these Nicks are, I'd consider myself an outstanding person. But I know I'm not alone in feeling this way about the people around us. And for this reason, for millennia, we've been searching for answers for the aging process, trying to get some answers, but there's still a lot of things we really don't know about this. And one of those major questions is, do we actually have to age? So far, unfortunately, the answer is yes. And many believe that the aging process is inevitable, that this is just going to happen. It's much like wear and tear on your car. You can do the scheduled maintenance, you can do the repairs, a lot like eating well and getting your exercise, but eventually something is going to fail. You can even replace some of those essential parts, but again, eventually something catastrophic is going to happen and we reach the same endpoint, the end of life. However, myself and researchers like me believe that in the future, we could possibly treat aging or possibly even cure it. For me, the critical point to doing this, the critical piece is understanding our biology at the most fundamental level. Now, I don't want to come up here and say that, hey, we're going to live longer just for the sake of living longer. Nobody wants to live to 150 and feel like they're 150. I'm 52 now, and I don't even want to feel like I'm 52. That's just going to get worse in the future. But the goal of this research is actually to generate something called the lifespan cliff. Even if we can't live forever, it's more like living to 150, but feeling like you're 25 to 30 years old before you have a steep decline into death. Now, this is much like what salmon do. Salmon, when they spawn, they're healthy, they're strong, but as soon as they lay their eggs, there's a rapid decline and into death. Their health falls off really fast. So, how can we actually establish this lifespan cliff? The key is likely in our genetic material, our DNA. Now, our DNA is that blueprint that tells our cells what to become and how to behave. And some theories predict that with the aging process, this results from small changes in our DNA over time that causes mutations that leads to your cells losing their ability to function. Now, this is certainly true for some diseases like cancers. You get a mutation, you will develop that cancer. But if this was the main driver of the aging process, we wouldn't be able to do cool things that we can do today with medical technology, like cloning. So you all remember Dolly the sheep. Now, Dolly was created by taking a cell from an adult sheep and convincing it was an embryo again. If the aging process was the result of these DNA changes, there would be no way to convince this cell that it was an embryo again. So for me, the aging process, what's driving this is not these small changes in your DNA. But if it's not these small changes, what else is going on at the level of our genetic material that can lead to the aging process? Well, there's an extra piece of information inside your DNA that tells your cells what to do. This is called the epigenome. This is a simple chemical code that marks your DNA and acts like dimmer switches to turn on the right genes at the right time or turn off genes that lead to the aging process. An important example of the epigenome comes from the different cell types in your body. So each of your cells has the same DNA code to it, Brain cells have the same code as your heart cells, but they have different epigenetic codes, a different epigenome that tells those heart cells to become heart cells and those brain cells to become brain cells. Another way of thinking of the epigenome is much like a new phone. You buy a phone from the factory, everybody's got the same phone, but as you load apps onto that phone, the apps act like the epigenome, and you get specific functions from that phone, and it becomes unique to you. So you're probably wondering, how does this actually relate to the aging process? Well, every time a cell in your body makes a copy of itself, it must, as faithfully as possible, not only copy the DNA, but also copy that epigenetic code, copy those dimmer switches. So the information theory of aging predicts that every time a cell does this, makes a copy of itself, it loses a little bit of information. This is very similar to ancient peoples copying manuscripts by hand, manuscripts and texts, that every time you make a copy or a copy of a copy, you slowly lose more and more information from that original. And because of this, your cells slowly forget who they are and how to function. This is the aging process. And this makes sense. When we come back to Dolly the sheep, she was created by taking that embryonic cell, or sorry, that adult cell, and convincing it it was an embryo again, turning on those dimmer switches to become young. And again, this is much like finding copies of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi Library, these pristine ancient texts that haven't undergone centuries of copying errors, so you know what the original code is. It's also very similar to finding the history button to a document on your computer. You know what that original was, and you know how you've changed it over time. But again, how does this actually relate to the aging process? If we can convince our epigenome and copy that from every time we make a new cell, it would keep our cells younger longer. We'd maintain that information over those long periods of time. So we need to keep those cells young by copying the epigenome. How can we actually achieve this? Well, the epigenome, unlike your DNA, is extremely sensitive to its environment. Our DNA doesn't change very often, but the epigenome can change within minutes of receiving a signal. Again, much like our dimmer switches. And the most important environmental factor regulating the epigenome is diet. And we've known for centuries that eating well leads to good health. But an excellent example of how important this is was shown in 2009, when a group of researchers completed a 25-year study looking at something we call caloric restriction. And this was done on monkeys. Now, caloric restriction is defined as a reduction in caloric intake or energy intake by 20% without causing malnutrition. Now, when we looked at these monkeys exposed to the caloric restriction conditions, they had many benefits to physical attributes like eye luster, posture, coat color, but most importantly, there was a significant decrease in all-cause mortality and a significant increase in lifespan as a result of this caloric restriction. Now, I'm not about to stand up here and finish my talk with eat right and get exercise. Believe me, this is really good advice, and we should do this, but we are inherently human, and we suck at doing this. We've sucked at it for centuries. But what if I could tell you there's a way to trick your cells into thinking they were undergoing caloric restriction without the rigors of this particular diet? Now, new research has identified compounds that mimic the impact of caloric restriction. These compounds essentially convince your cells that they don't have enough nutrients or calories, when in fact they do. This activates the dimmer switches inside your cells to promote longevity while shutting off those dimmer switches associated with the aging process. So, what are some of these magic compounds? One of them is metformin, and this is a small compound we find in French lilac plants. It's currently being used to treat type 2 diabetic patients. And what metformin does is it activates those dimmer switch to resensitize your cells to important molecules like insulin while turning on genes associated with glucose uptake. Interestingly, when we look at large cohorts of people taking metformin, there's a significant reduction in all-cause cancers in these individuals, as compared to so-called healthy individuals not taking metformin. Another one of these important compounds is something called resveratrol, which again is mimicking caloric restriction. This compound is naturally found in red grapes and in red wine, and it activates an important enzyme in your cells, an important dimmer switch called sirtuin-1. Now, sirtuin-1 turns on genes associated with longevity, and again, just for emphasis, it is that important dimmer switch that's actually activated during caloric restriction. Now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I don't want you to get any big ideas about your new wine-fueled longevity program. Unfortunately, there's not enough resveratrol in a bottle of wine to have much of an impact on your cells. You would need, depending on the wine, between 8 and 30 bottles of wine in one sitting. Yeah, you're getting your resveratrol, but you probably have a few more issues that are dealing with your wine consumption. I also don't want you to get the impression that you should go out and get a prescription for metformin. Now, I really believe in metformin as a compound, but we still need to do some testing and some trials to ensure that this is a safe compound and it has no ill side effects. But what I am telling you is by studying metformin and resveratrol, as well as dimmer switches like sirtuin-1, we are learning about the biology of aging. So, where does my research program fit into this? My research team is focusing on natural compounds we find in fruits and vegetables that give them their vibrant colors. This is a class of compounds called phenolics. So we are currently examining how these phenolics are interacting with our dimmer switches, potentially turning on those genes that are controlling those longevity switches, controlling the aging process. Now, I know you're all sitting in your seats wondering, Chris, what food should I be eating to activate these dimmer switches so I can achieve a lifespan cliff or potentially live forever? Unfortunately, right now, I don't think there's a single magic bullet compound or a magic fountain of youth food that will keep you alive. However, through our research here at the university and in my research group, we are learning more about the biology of aging, how we can adapt strategies like caloric restriction to keep those important individuals, those nicks in our lives, with us longer, but more importantly, living healthier, happier lives. Thank you very much.